They changed the locks on my house while I was standing at my husband's grave. That was the moment I realized something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Not quietly, not politely, not the way families are supposed to handle things. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 72 years old. And the house they tried to take from me wasn't just a piece of property with a white fence and a two-car garage sitting on half an acre in Greenville County. It was 43 years of my life. Every mortgage payment, every Christmas morning, every night I stayed up, wondering how I was going to raise a son on my own after my husband passed. I remember standing there in the cemetery, the grass still damp from the morning sprinklers, holding a small bouquet I bought for $12 at the grocery store because Frank never liked anything extravagant, and my phone buzzed in my purse. Once, then again, then a third time, and I almost ignored it because grief teaches you to ignore the world for a while. But something told me to look, and when I did, it was a text from my daughter-in-law Olivia. Just 6 words. We had to make some changes, nothing more. No explanation, no warmth. Just that flat, controlled tone she always used when she thought she was being reasonable. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I just stood there a little longer, staring at Frank's name carved into stone, and I said out loud, "You always told me to pay attention to the details, because that's who he was, a man who never signed anything without reading every line twice. A man who believed that ownership wasn't about who lived in a place, but whose name was written where it mattered." I drove home slowly, the same road I had taken for decades, past the diner where we used to have breakfast on Sundays, past the gas station where Ethan learned to pump his first tank, and when I turned onto my street, something felt wrong before I even saw it, like the air had shifted, like the house itself was holding its breath. Their car was in the driveway, a black SUV they bought last year, parked right where Frank used to park his truck, and I remember thinking that detail mattered more than it should have. But it did. I stepped out, walked up to my front door, the same door I had painted twice with my own hands, and that's when I saw it, a new lock, shiny, unfamiliar, reflecting the afternoon sun like it didn't belong there. Like it was announcing something I hadn't agreed to. I tried my key anyway, out of habit more than hope, and it didn't fit, not even close. I didn't knock. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there for a second, feeling the weight of something settle into place inside me. Something cold and very clear, because in that moment I understood exactly what they thought they had done, and more importantly, what they thought I wouldn't do next. I could hear movement inside, faint footsteps, a cabinet closing, the low hum of voices that stopped the second they realized I was outside, and then the door opened, Olivia standing there with that same composed expression, like she had rehearsed this, like she had already decided how this conversation would go, and behind her, my son Ethan, avoiding my eyes, and she said it calmly, almost kindly, "Margaret, we need to talk about the house," and I looked past her into my own living room, the couch I picked out 15 years ago, the photos still on the wall, everything exactly where I had left it that morning, and I said nothing, not yet, because I had already remembered something they hadn't even thought to ask about, something Frank made sure of years before any of this started, and as I stood there, locked out of my own home, I realized they hadn't taken anything from me at all, not really. They had just made their first mistake. Olivia kept the door half closed like she was doing me a favor by opening it at all, and Ethan stood a few steps behind her with his hands in his pockets, not saying a word, not even meeting my eyes, and that silence told me more than anything else could have. "We were going to call you," Olivia said, her voice smooth, practiced, like she had repeated that sentence until it sounded reasonable even to herself, and I nodded slowly because I had learned a long time ago that people reveal more when you let them keep talking, so I stepped back from the door instead of pushing forward, giving her space, giving them both the illusion that this was still their conversation to control. "We think it is time to make things more practical," she continued, gesturing lightly toward the house behind her, toward my house. As if it were already something shared, something negotiable. "This place is a lot for you to manage on your own, and we are here now, so it just makes sense that we take over the responsibilities." And there it was, not loud, not aggressive, just Quiet entitlement wrapped in concern, the kind that sounds almost kind if you do not listen carefully. Ethan finally spoke then, his voice lower, hesitant. "Mom, we are just trying to help," and I looked at him for a long second, really looked. The same boy I had raised, the same face I had memorized through years of scraped knees and school plays and late-night talks at the kitchen table, and I realized something had shifted in him too, something small at first, maybe years ago, but now it had grown into something I did not recognize. "Help," I repeated softly, not as a question, just as a word I wanted to hear out loud, and Olivia stepped in again before he could answer. "Yes, help, and part of that means setting boundaries, Margaret," she said, using my name like we were colleagues discussing a business arrangement. "We need stability here, and that means clear ownership and control. So we had the locks changed this morning." She added it so casually, like she was telling me they had rearranged the furniture, and for a moment the only sound between us was the faint hum of the air conditioner from inside, steady, indifferent, like nothing had changed at all. I nodded again, once, slow, deliberate. And I could feel that cold clarity settle deeper, not anger, not panic, just a quiet understanding of exactly where we were standing. "You said you wanted us to feel like this was our home," Ethan added quickly, almost defensively, like he needed to justify it to himself as much as to me, and I remembered that conversation, years ago, when I told him there would always be a place for him here, a place he could come back to no matter what, and I realized he had heard something different, something simpler, something easier to take. "It is our house now," Olivia said then, more firmly this time, like she was closing the conversation, like she expected that sentence to settle everything, and I watched her face carefully, the confidence, the certainty, the complete absence of doubt, and I understood that she believed it, truly believed that access meant ownership, that living in a place long enough made it yours, that decisions made in daylight did not have shadows attached to them. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind them of the years, the payments, the paperwork, none of it, because none of that mattered in that moment. Not yet. Instead, I reached into my purse, not for my phone. Not for a key that no longer worked, but for something much smaller, a folded piece of paper I had not looked at in years, something Frank had handed me one evening at the kitchen table with that same careful tone he used for everything important, and I had tucked it away without fully understanding why it would matter one day. I did not take it out, not yet. I just felt it there, solid, real, and I looked back at them, at the door, at the new lock catching the light, and I said quietly, "I see." Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe they have already won, and as I turned and walked back down the driveway, past their car, past the mailbox with my name still printed on it, I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for a reaction that never came, and by the time I reached the end of the street, I had already decided what my next call would be, not to them, not to argue, but to someone who understood exactly what ownership meant when it was written in ink instead of spoken out loud. I did not drive far, just 3 blocks past the elementary school where Ethan used to run out every afternoon with his backpack half open and his shoes untied, and I pulled over beneath a large oak tree that had been there longer than any of us, its branches stretching wide like it had seen generations come and go and knew exactly how these things played out. I sat there with the engine still running for a moment, both hands resting on the steering wheel, steady, not shaking, not anymore, because the shock had already passed and what replaced it was something much quieter, something more precise. I reached into my purse and took out the folded paper, smoothing it carefully across my lap, and I could still see Frank sitting at the kitchen table all those years ago, his reading glasses low on his nose, a pen in his hand, explaining something I did not fully understand at the time because I trusted him to handle those things, the details, the legal side, the parts of life that required more than just love and effort. "Margaret," he had said, tapping the document gently, "ownership is not about who lives in a place. It is about what is written and what is recorded, and more importantly, how it is structured." And I remember nodding, not because I understood, but because I trusted him completely, the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. Now, sitting there alone, I read the same lines again, slower this time, and the words felt different, heavier, like they carried weight I had not needed to feel before. The house was not just in my name, not entirely. Not in the simple way Ethan and Olivia clearly believed. It was placed in a trust, one that Frank had set up years before he passed, with very specific language about control, residency, and transfer. Language that did not bend to assumptions or convenience, or anyone deciding. Something made sense. I folded the paper again, carefully, and placed it back into my purse, and then I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed in a long time, a name that felt distant until that moment. And I pressed call. David Morrison speaking. The voice on the other end said, calm, professional, exactly the same as I remembered, and for a second I closed my eyes, grounding myself in the sound of something steady. David, this is Margaret Collins, I said, my voice even, controlled. I need to schedule an appointment today, if possible. There was a brief pause, the kind that comes when someone recognizes both the name and the tone behind it. Of course, Margaret, is everything all right? He asked, and I looked out through the windshield at the quiet street, the empty sidewalks, the ordinary afternoon that had continued without interruption while my entire situation had shifted. I need to review the trust documents Frank established for the house, I replied, choosing my words carefully, not rushed, not emotional, just factual, and I need to understand exactly what authority they give me right now. Another pause, shorter this time. More focused. I can see you this afternoon at 3, he said. Bring whatever documentation you have. I nodded even though he could not see me. I will be there, I said, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the passenger seat and took one long, steady breath. I did not call Ethan. I did not send a message. I did not explain anything, because there was nothing to explain yet. Not until I knew exactly where every line was drawn and what every clause allowed. As I started the car again and pulled back onto the road, I realized something that surprised me. I was not thinking about getting back into the house, not immediately, not emotionally. I was thinking about something else entirely. Something Frank had said once when we first signed those documents, something I had almost forgotten until now. One day, he had told me, this will protect you from people who think they understand ownership better than they do, and as I drove toward the office, I understood that. They had already arrived, and they just did not know it yet. I arrived at David Morrison's office 10 minutes early, the same red brick building on Main Street that had not changed in over 20 years, and I sat in my car for a moment before going in, watching people walk past with their coffee cups and briefcases, living their ordinary afternoons without knowing how quickly things could shift when someone decided to take what was not theirs. I stepped inside, and the air was cool, quiet, controlled, the kind of place where nothing happened without documentation, without signatures, without intention, and that alone steadied me more than anything else had that day. David greeted me at the door of his office, older now, more gray in his hair, but with the same calm expression, the same measured way of speaking that never rushed to conclusions. Margaret, he said, shaking my hand, it has been a long time, and I nodded, offering a small smile that did not reach very far because there was no need for small talk today. I brought the document Frank gave me, I said, placing the folded paper carefully on his desk, and he opened it with the kind of attention that told me he already understood this was not a casual visit. He read silently for a few moments, his eyes moving line by line. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together, considering, not reacting, just thinking. Tell me what happened, he said. And I did, not emotionally. Not with raised voices or accusations, just the facts, the new lock, the words they used, the assumption they made, and he listened without interrupting, the way professionals do when they are building a complete picture before speaking. When I finished, there was a brief pause, and then he nodded once, slowly, like something had just confirmed itself. They believe the house is theirs, he said, not as a question, and I nodded. Yes, I replied, they said it clearly. And he exhaled quietly, not in frustration, not in surprise, just in recognition. That belief is not supported by the structure Frank put in place, he said. turning the document slightly toward me and tapping a specific section with his pen. This property is held in a revocable living trust, and you are the sole trustee with full authority over residency, access, and control during your lifetime. He paused to let that settle, and I felt something shift again, not shock this time, but confirmation, solid and grounded. What does that mean for what they did? I asked, keeping my voice even, because I wanted clarity, not comfort. It means, he said carefully, that they do not have the legal right to exclude you from the property, to change locks without your authorization, or to assert ownership in the way they are attempting to do. He leaned forward slightly, his tone still calm, still controlled. In fact, what they have done puts them in a very vulnerable position if you choose to act, and I considered that word, choose, because that was what this came down to now, not whether I could respond, but how I would. What are my options? I asked, and he outlined them clearly, no dramatics. Just steps, documentation, formal notice, enforcement if necessary, each one precise, each one grounded in the same thing Frank had always trusted, the written structure. I listened, taking in every detail, not interrupting, not rushing. Because this was not about reacting anymore, it was about understanding exactly how to move forward. When he finished, I sat there for a moment, hands folded in my lap, and I realized something that surprised me again. I was not angry. Not in the way people expect. I was focused, because the situation had moved out of emotion and into something far more stable. Prepare whatever needs to be prepared, I said finally, my voice steady. I want everything documented properly. He nodded once. Already reaching for a folder, already shifting into action, and as I watched him begin that process, I thought back to the moment at the door, the new lock, the words they used, the certainty in Olivia's voice, and I understood something they did not. Certainty without understanding is just another kind of mistake, and they had made more than one. I left David's office just after 4 p.m. with a folder in my hand that felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper inside, but because of what it represented: clarity, structure, authority. Things that do not raise their voices, but do not need to either. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and I stood there for a moment beside my car, looking down at the folder, running my fingers lightly over the edge as if I could feel the years Frank had spent making sure everything was in order, every line intentional, every clause placed exactly where it needed to be. I did not rush back to the house. I did not drive straight there in some dramatic return, because this was not about confrontation. Not yet. This was about sequence, about doing things in the right order so that nothing could be questioned later. I got into the car and placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat, then started the engine and drove toward the one place I had not thought about earlier, the bank. Because David had been very clear about something that I had almost overlooked. Access is not just physical, it is also financial, and control over one often reflects control over the other. The bank was quiet when I walked in, a few people waiting, a teller counting bills behind the counter, everything normal, steady, and I waited my turn like anyone else. Not because I had to, but because routine matters. It keeps things grounded. When I reached the desk, I asked to speak with the branch manager, not urgently, not emotionally, just directly. And within a few minutes I was seated across from a man who introduced himself as Mr. Harris, polite, attentive, the kind of person who listens carefully before responding. "How can I help you today, Mrs. Collins?" he asked. And I placed the folder on the desk between us, opening it to the relevant section without hesitation. "I need to review and update all access connected to my property and associated accounts," I said, my voice calm, measured, the same way I had spoken to David. "Because consistency matters when you want to be taken seriously." He nodded, glancing down at the documents, his expression shifting slightly as he recognized the legal structure, the trust, the authority attached to it. "Of course," he said, leaning forward. "We can go through everything together," and we did, line by line, account by account, confirming who had access, who did not, what could be changed immediately, and what required formal notice, each step deliberate, each one reinforcing the same reality. Ownership is not a feeling, it is a record. I did not mention Ethan. I did not mention Olivia. I did not explain the situation in emotional terms, because none of that was necessary here. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. When we finished, Mr. Harris printed a set of confirmations and slid them across the desk to me. "Everything you requested has been processed," he said, and I nodded once, taking the papers and placing them neatly back into the folder. "Thank you," I replied, standing, and as I walked out of the bank, I felt that same quiet clarity settle even deeper. Not satisfaction, not yet, but alignment, like pieces moving into place exactly as they were designed to. By the time I got back into my car, the sky was beginning to shift toward evening, the light softer now, the day closing in a way that felt almost symbolic, and I sat there for a moment before turning the key again, thinking about the house, the new lock, the words they had used, and I realized something that made me pause. They were probably inside right now, comfortable, settled, believing that nothing had changed since I left, believing that the absence of my reaction meant acceptance, and that was the mistake. Because while they were adjusting furniture and making plans, I had been doing something else entirely, something they had not accounted for, something they would not see until it was already in motion, and as I finally pulled out of the parking lot and turned toward home, I understood that what came next would not require raised voices or arguments at the door. It would require timing, and timing, like everything else Frank ever taught me, was never accidental. I did not rush when I turned onto my street, even though every instinct from years of raising a child alone told me to go straight to the door and demand answers. But instincts built on emotion are not always the ones that protect you best, so I slowed down instead, letting the car roll gently to a stop across from the house, not in the driveway, not directly in front, just close enough to see without being seen too quickly. The lights inside were on, the living room glowing softly through the curtains, and I could make out movement, shadows crossing from one side to the other, casual, unhurried, like they had already settled into something permanent. I sat there for a moment with the engine off, the quiet of the car wrapping around me. And I realized something that felt almost distant now. Earlier that day I might have knocked, I might have tried to explain, I might have asked Ethan why, but that version of me had already passed somewhere between the cemetery and David's office, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need immediate answers. I reached for my phone and checked the time, a little after 6 in the evening. Then I opened the folder again, reviewing the documents one more time. Not because I doubted them, but because repetition creates certainty, and certainty leaves no room for hesitation. There it was, clearly written, trustee authority, full control, no ambiguity, no shared ownership unless I chose it, and I had not chosen it. I closed the folder and placed it back on the seat, then stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, not quickly, not slowly, just with purpose, each step measured, each movement controlled. As I reached the front path, the porch light flicked on. Automatic, the same way it had for years, and for a brief second it felt like nothing had changed at all, like I could reach into my purse, pull out my key, and walk inside like I had done thousands of times before. But instead I stopped just short of the door, noticing again the new lock, the clean metal, the unfamiliar shine. I did not knock right away. I let the silence sit for a moment, long enough for them to notice, long enough for the house itself to feel different. And then I raised my hand and knocked once, firm, not aggressive, just enough to be heard. Footsteps approached, quicker this time, less casual, and the door opened to Olivia again, her expression shifting slightly when she saw me standing there, not upset, not pleading, just present. "Margaret," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice this time, "we thought you might need some time," and I nodded, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. Behind her, Ethan stood in the hallway, watching, his posture uncertain, like he was waiting to see which direction this would go. I looked at both of them for a moment, taking in the scene, the familiar walls behind them, the space they believed they had claimed, and I spoke calmly. Evenly, "I do not need time," I said, my voice steady, carrying just enough to settle into the room behind her. "I need clarity," and Olivia straightened slightly, her expression tightening just enough to show That this was not the response she had expected. "We already discussed this," she replied, her tone firm again, trying to return to control. "We are just organizing things in a way that makes sense." And I let that sentence sit for a second, then I nodded once. Slowly, as if I were agreeing, though I was not. "That is exactly what I have been doing as well," I said, and for the first time since I arrived, I reached into my purse and placed the folder gently against my side, not opening it, not yet, just letting it be visible enough to change the weight of the moment. Ethan noticed it immediately, his eyes shifting from my face to the folder and back again, something uncertain moving behind his expression, something that had not been there earlier. Olivia followed his glance, then looked back at me, and for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, her certainty wavered, not gone, but not as solid as before, and that was all I needed to see, because doubt, once it appears, does not leave quietly. I did not step forward, I did not ask to come in, I simply stood there and said, "Tomorrow morning, there will be a conversation that includes more than just the three of us," and I paused, letting the words settle, letting them understand that something had shifted beyond their control, and at that point, "We will all be very clear about what this house actually is," and I turned slightly, not fully leaving yet, just enough to signal that this moment was no longer about negotiation, it was about sequence, and as I walked back toward my car, I did not look back, because I already knew they were standing there, watching, trying to understand what they had not anticipated, and for the first time that day, I was certain of one thing: they were no longer as comfortable inside that house as they had been an hour ago. That night, I did not sleep in the house, not because I could not, but because I chose not to, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I stayed at a small hotel 15 minutes away, nothing fancy. Just a clean room with a single lamp by the bed and a window that looked out over a quiet parking lot, and I sat there for a long time with the folder open in front of me, reading every line again, not searching for something new, but reinforcing what was already there, what had always been there. I thought about Ethan. About the years I spent making sure he never felt unstable, never felt like anything could be taken from him, and I realized that somewhere along the way, he had mistaken security for entitlement, something given freely for something owed permanently. And that was not something I could correct with a conversation at the front door. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, the way I had for most of my life, habit built from years of responsibility, and I got ready slowly, deliberately, choosing a simple outfit, nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested confrontation, because this was not about appearance, it was about presence. By 8:30, I was back in the car, the folder beside me, and I drove toward the house again, the streets still quiet, the day just beginning. And when I turned onto my street, I saw something different immediately. Ethan's car was gone, Olivia's still there, but the curtains were drawn tighter, the house looking less open, less certain than it had the evening before. I parked this time in the driveway. Not across the street, not at a distance, but exactly where I had parked for years, and I stepped out, closing the door behind me with a calm, steady motion. A second car pulled in behind me just minutes later, a dark sedan, and David stepped out, carrying a briefcase, his expression neutral, professional, the same calm authority he had in his office, and he nodded once as he approached. "Ready?" he asked quietly, and I nodded in return, because readiness is not something you declare loudly. It is something you carry. We walked to the front door together, and I knocked once, firm, the same way I had the night before, and this time the response was quicker, more tense, Olivia opening the door with a look that shifted immediately when she saw David standing beside me. "Margaret," she said, her voice tighter now, less controlled. "What is this?" And I did not answer right away. I simply stepped slightly to the side, giving David a clear line to the doorway. "Good morning," he said calmly, introducing himself with measured precision. "I represent Mrs. Collins regarding the property you are currently occupying." And there it was, the shift from assumption to structure, from conversation to record, and I watched as Olivia's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that something she believed was stable was beginning to move. Ethan appeared behind her then, his face drawn, his eyes moving quickly between me and David, And I could see it now, the uncertainty, the realization that this was no longer something he could navigate with a few words or a quiet agreement. David opened his briefcase and removed a set of documents, holding them at a level where both of them could see clearly, not forcing them, not pushing forward, just presenting what was already true. This property is held under a revocable living trust, he said evenly, his voice carrying just enough to fill the space without raising in volume, and Mrs. Collins is the sole trustee with full authority over access and control. He paused, allowing the information to settle, not rushing past it. Any changes to locks, access, or occupancy without her authorization are not legally supported, and I stood there beside him, not speaking, not adding anything, because this was not my moment to argue. It was my moment to let the truth stand on its own. Olivia's posture shifted slightly, her arms crossing in front of her, a small defensive movement that would have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching so carefully, and Ethan stepped forward just enough to speak, his voice lower now, less certain. "Mom, we did not know," he said, and I looked at him for a long second before responding, my voice calm, steady, unchanged from the day before. "That is exactly the problem," I said, not harsh, not emotional, just clear, because not knowing does not change what is written, and as the silence settled between us, I could feel it, the moment where belief meets reality, and reality does not bend. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, and in that silence, something changed in the air inside that doorway, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift where certainty began to lose its footing. Olivia's eyes moved from David to the documents in his hand, then back to me, calculating, searching for something she could still hold on to. Some version of control she had not yet lost, and when she spoke again, her voice was still composed, but thinner now, less anchored. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she said, choosing her words carefully, as if precision alone could undo what had already been established. David did not react emotionally. He simply turned one page slightly forward, angling it so both of them could see clearly. "There is no misunderstanding here," he replied, calm and exact. "The trust document is very clear. Mrs. Collins retains full authority over this property during her lifetime, including access, occupancy, and control of any structural or security changes," and he paused just long enough for the words to settle fully. "That includes the locks that were changed without her consent," and I watched as Olivia's posture shifted again, not a full step back, but enough to show that the ground she thought was solid had begun to move beneath her. Ethan stepped forward then, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "So what happens now?" he asked, not looking at Olivia this time, but at me, and that was the first real shift, the moment where he stopped aligning with assumption and started facing consequence. I met his eyes, not with anger, not with accusation, just with clarity, because that was all that was needed now. David answered before I did, his tone steady, structured. "At this point, Mrs. Collins has the legal right to restore access immediately and to determine who is permitted to remain on the property," he said, and then he added, just as evenly, "Any continued occupation without her authorization could be considered a violation of that right." And there it was, not a threat, not raised voices, just the weight of what was written, laid out plainly. Olivia let out a small breath, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the first sign that she understood the situation had moved beyond what she could manage with words alone. "We were trying to help," she said again, but this time it sounded different, less certain, more like something she needed to believe rather than something she could defend. I let that sit for a moment before responding, because timing matters, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, even, unchanged. "Help does not remove my authority," I said, each word placed deliberately, not rushed, not emphasized, just clear. Ethan looked down briefly, then back up, and I could see it now, the realization settling in, not all at once, but enough to change the direction of the moment. David closed the folder slowly, not as a signal of ending, but as a signal that everything necessary had already been presented. "Mrs. Collins will be resuming full access to the property today," he said, and then he looked at both of them with the same calm professionalism. I recommend that you cooperate with that process. And there was no force behind the words, no pressure, just the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly where the line is drawn. I stepped forward then, just one step, not crossing into the house yet, but close enough that the threshold felt real again, like something that belonged to me not because I demanded it, but because it had always been mine. Olivia hesitated for a fraction of a second, then moved aside, not dramatically, not with apology, just enough to clear the doorway, and that movement said more than anything she could have explained. I did not rush inside. I did not look around. I simply stepped across the threshold, feeling the familiar floor beneath my feet, the same space that had never actually changed, only been misunderstood. Behind me, the silence held, heavier now, more honest, and as I stood there in the entryway, I realized something that settled everything completely. They had not lost the house in that moment, because it had never been theirs to lose. What they lost was the belief that they could decide what belonged to me without ever asking. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel it fully, the shift, the quiet return of something that had never actually left, and then I walked further into the house, each step steady, measured, not rushed, the familiar creak of the floor near the hallway greeting me the same way it had for years, unchanged, unaffected by who believed they controlled it. Behind me, I could hear movement, soft, uncertain. Ethan stepping aside, Olivia adjusting her stance as if trying to recalibrate her position in a situation that no longer followed her expectations. I did not turn around immediately. I let them follow if they chose, because this was not about forcing anything. It was about letting reality settle in its own time. I placed my purse on the small table by the entryway, the same place I had always placed it, and I ran my fingers lightly over the surface, grounding myself in something simple, something real. Before turning back to face them, Ethan looked different now, not because anything about him had physically changed, but because something behind his eyes had shifted, the certainty replaced by something more honest, something that recognized the line that had been crossed. "Mom," he said quietly, and I held his gaze, not interrupting, not rushing to respond, allowing him the space to finish whatever he needed to say. "We thought," he began, then paused, as if realizing the weight of that word. And I nodded once, acknowledging it without agreeing to it. "Yes," I said calmly, "you thought," and I let the silence sit again, not to punish, but to make the moment clear, because clarity is not always comfortable. Olivia stepped forward. Slightly, her posture still composed, but no longer firm, no longer anchored in the same confidence she had shown the day before. "This does not have to be a conflict," she said, her tone softer now, more measured, as if she were searching for a version of the situation that could still be negotiated. I looked at her for a moment, considering not her words, but what they represented, the shift from assumption to reconsideration. And I responded just as evenly. "It is not a conflict," I said. "It is a correction," and that distinction mattered, because one implies a fight, the other implies a return to what was always true. David stood quietly near the doorway, not intervening, not adding anything, his presence alone enough to hold the structure in place, and I appreciated that, the way he allowed the situation to settle without pushing it further than it needed to go. I took a slow breath, then continued, my voice steady, not raised, not emotional. "You were not wrong to want stability," I said, looking at Ethan, "but you were wrong to assume control without understanding what you were taking," and I could see that land, not as an accusation, but as something he could not easily dismiss. Olivia remained still, listening now rather than leading, and that was another shift, one that did not need to be pointed out. I walked past them then, moving into the living room. The same room where I had spent decades building a life that was never meant to be reduced to a simple claim, and I stopped near the window, looking out at the yard, the same yard Frank had taken care of every weekend. The same space that had never needed to be defended until now. "You can stay," I said finally, turning slightly so they could hear me clearly, and both of them looked up, surprised, not expecting that outcome, and I let that surprise settle before continuing. "But you stay as guests, not owners. Not decision makers, not replacements. Each word placed carefully, not to diminish, but to define. Ethan nodded slowly, the movement small but real, and Olivia did not respond right away, which told me enough. I picked up the folder again, holding it loosely at my side, not as a threat, but as a reminder, and I walked toward the hallway, toward the rest of the house, reclaiming not just the space, but the position that had always been mine.